Adele Marsh stood on the wet sidewalk of Wyndham Avenue with 2 suitcases and a framed photograph, and 50 years of her life was behind her in a house that no longer had her name on it. The bank had been precise about the timeline, polite in its language, and immovable in every way that mattered. That night, alone in a motel room 8 blocks away, the portrait slipped from her hands and the glass shattered on the floor. And what fell out from behind the broken frame was something Calvin had hidden there since 1987. A folded document, a key with a small pine cone on the chain, and a note in his handwriting that began, "I built this for you. I'm sorry I could not give it to you in person." What Adele found when she followed that key to a mountain town in Tennessee was something no one who had written her off was prepared for. And what Calvin had built there, alone, over the course of 34 years, left every person who had doubted her without a single useful thing to say. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Adele had lived on Wyndham Avenue since the spring of 1974, which meant she had lived there through 8 presidents, the birth of her daughter Penny, the death of her parents and Calvin's father, and somewhere in the range of 18,000 mornings of coffee at the kitchen table beside the window that looked out over the yard she had been tending, plant by plant and season by season, for half a century. She knew the house the way you know a face you have looked at every day for most of your life. The particular groan of the second step on the staircase, the way the back door stuck every August when the wood swelled in the heat, the angle of the late afternoon light in November that came through the sitting room window and landed on the armchair where Calvin had always read. She knew which hydrangeas bloomed first in June and which section of the back fence needed attention every spring without fail, and where the soil was richest near the old oak and where it needed work. She had put her hands into that yard for 50 years. She had watched it become something that neighbors stopped to admire from the sidewalk, something that had taken longer than a decade just to find its shape. Calvin had been a woodworker, not a carpenter in the hired sense, though he had taken jobs over the years when they needed the income. He was a craftsman in the older meaning of the word, a man who understood, with the way certain people understand music, by instinct and by feel before the thinking begins. He had built the bookshelves in the sitting room and the window bench in the bedroom and the dining table at which they had eaten 50 years of meals together. Good meals and difficult ones. Holiday dinners and ordinary Wednesday suppers that added up over decades into a life. He built things to last because he had no interest in building them any other way. His hands were large and careful and slightly rough along the palms, and they were the hands she had held across that dining table for 5 decades. He had also, for as long as she had known him, been a man who processed trouble alone. It was the underside of the same quality that made him reliable. The things that worried him went inward, were worked through in the garage at 10 at night, rather than across the kitchen table, were resolved by the time he came to bed, so that she never had to carry the unfinished version. She had benefited from this for a long time without fully naming it. She named it later, after she understood what it had cost him to carry certain things without telling her. What she did not know, because he had not told her, was that the adjustment had included a reverse mortgage on the house on Wyndham Avenue, a loan against the equity they had built over 5 decades, used to cover the cost of treatments that bought them 2 more years together. She had signed documents during that period, a stack of medical and financial paperwork presented to her during the months when she was managing Calvin's care and her own fear at the same time. She had signed what he placed in front of her because she trusted him and because examining each document carefully would have required a version of herself she did not have available while also being his caregiver. Calvin died on a Monday in March. The bank's letter arrived 6 months later. The new owner's representative arrived at 2 in the afternoon, a young woman in a company lanyard who had the manner of someone carrying out a task she had not designed and was not personally responsible for. Adele stood on the sidewalk in the October cold with her 2 suitcases and the portrait and looked at the house. The hydrangea by the front gate was bare now, but the shape of it was still there, the shape she had been pruning and tending since 1978, and the shape was something she had made. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her suitcases and walked to the taxi. She had been moving since 6 in the morning, The final walkthrough, the boxes, the sidewalk, the taxi, the check-in at the front desk where a young man had handed her a key card with practiced efficiency. The movement had been its own kind of mercy, filling the hours with things that required her attention and left no room for what she was carrying underneath all of it. Now the movement had stopped. The room was quiet. The thing she had been carrying was there with her, fully, without anything between her and it. She had been a widow for 6 months. She was also, now, without the house where she had been a wife and a mother and a neighbor and a gardener and everything else she had been for 50 years. The two losses were different from each other, but they had arrived close enough together that they had the quality of a single blow. She reached for the portrait. She was not sure what she was reaching for exactly. The particular solace, maybe, of looking at a specific face rather than a general memory. She picked it up. She held it. Then it slipped. Her hands were tired. She had been holding things all day. The portrait fell against the edge of the table, and the glass broke, and the frame came apart the way frames do when the joints fail, cleanly, in pieces, the components separating from each other and settling on the floor. She knelt to pick up the pieces. The photograph of Calvin in his anniversary jacket was unharmed, face up, clear the glass. She picked it up carefully, and then she saw it. The frame had a back panel she had never known about. A thin piece of wood fitted behind the backing board, the kind of thing a craftsman would know how to build into a frame, the kind of thing no one else would think to look for. The panel had come loose in the fall. Behind it was a folded piece of paper, and resting against the paper, tied with a short length of twine to a small loop on the panel itself, was a key. Old-fashioned, simple, with a keychain, a small dried pine cone, the kind that falls from certain trees in the mountains of Tennessee. Adele sat on the floor of room 9 at the Crestline Motor Lodge and unfolded the paper with hands that had stopped being tired. The document was a property deed. She recognized the form. They had signed one together in 1974 when they bought the house on Wyndham Avenue, and the layout of it, the columns of legal description, the official stamps, the signature lines, was something the body remembered even when the mind had not thought about it in decades. She understood what she was looking at within the first few lines. A deed of ownership, a parcel of land and the structure upon it, located on Ridgeback Road in Sable Creek, Tennessee, dated 1987, in the name of Calvin Arthur Marsh. She read it twice. Then she unfolded the note that had been tucked inside it. Calvin's handwriting was the handwriting of a man who had taught himself precision in every form his work required. Neat, slightly angular, the letters evenly spaced. She had seen on shopping lists and birthday cards and the labels he made for the drawers in his workshop. She knew it the way she knew the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. She had not seen it in 6 months, and seeing it now, on the floor of a motel room in October, was something she had not been prepared for. The note was not long. Calvin had never been long when brief would do. In 47 years of marriage, he had written her perhaps a dozen letters, all of them short. He wrote that he had bought the land in 1987 with money saved from a stretch of good work. A contract with a historic preservation organization in Eastern Tennessee that had brought him in to restore the woodwork of 3 19th century structures. The pay had been the best of his career to that point. The land in Sable Creek had been inexpensive. The town was small and largely overlooked at the time, the kind of place that had not yet been discovered by people with money looking for places to spend it. He had driven through it on the way back from a job in the spring of 1987 and had pulled the truck over on Ridgeback Road and stood on a ridge above the valley and looked at the mountains and thought, someday. He wrote that he had worked on the cabin over the years, on weekends when he told her he had jobs out of town, which was plausible and she had never questioned it, because out-of-town work was a regular part of his life and he had always come home when he said he would. He had used what he saved from demolitions, timber pulled from structures being torn down, old-growth lumber that was no longer milled and could not be replaced once it was gone. He had recognized it for what it was and had not been able to watch it be destroyed. So he had taken it south, load by load, over the course of years, and had used it to build something on that ridge above Sable Creek. He had never told her because he wanted it to be a surprise. A retirement surprise, he wrote. The one he had been building the longest. He had planned to drive her down there on a Saturday morning without telling her where they were going, The way he had once driven her to the Vermont Inn for their anniversary, without telling her until they were already in New Hampshire. He had wanted to see her face when she saw the view from the ridge for the first time. He was sorry, he wrote, that he was leaving before he could do that. The cabin was hers. It had always been hers. He had built it for her, and he hoped she would go there, and he hoped the mountains would be good to her, and he hoped she would sit on the porch in the evenings and look at the view he had been looking at alone for 34 years while he thought about the day he would finally show it to her. At the bottom of the note, in the slightly smaller handwriting he used when he was finishing something and running low on space, he had written, "The key is for the front door. There's a mat on the porch I put there in 2018. It says home." Adele sat on the floor of room 9 and held the note and the deed and the key with its small pine cone, and she cried in the way of someone who has been given something by a person they have lost. The grief and the gratitude arriving at the same time, indistinguishable from each other, the way they had been indistinguishable in the months since Calvin died, when she had found herself grateful for 50 years and devastated by the absence of more of them in the same breath. Calvin had been protecting her. That was the shape of it, when she held it still long enough to see it clearly. The reverse mortgage had been an act of love and an act of concealment at the same time, both things true at once in the way that things are sometimes true in more than one direction when the person at the center of them loved imperfectly and completely simultaneously. He had decided, without telling her, which thing to protect. He had chosen his life over the house. She had spent the months since learning about the mortgage somewhere between anger and grief, in a place between forgiveness and acceptance where you live when the person who hurt you is also the person you're mourning. But the cabin had existed alongside the mortgage the whole time, separate from it, paid for outright, in his name alone, untouched by any of it. He had not planned for the two things to align themselves into a rescue. She was certain of that. The mortgage and the deed had lived in different compartments of his mind, the one a painful necessity and the other a long-held private hope, and the circumstances had brought them together into something he had not designed but had, in the end, made possible. He had left her a door. She got up from the floor. She washed her face at the small bathroom sink. She sat at the table and found Sable Creek on her phone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was going to go see it. She put the key in her coat pocket where her hand could reach it. She looked up bus schedules. She looked up the distance. She looked at the photograph of the ridge one more time, and then she turned off the light and lay down on the bed with her coat still on, and she did not sleep for a long time, and when she finally did, her hand was still in her pocket, her fingers still around the pine cone on the keychain, small and dry and specific. The kind of thing a person picks up on a mountain trail because it catches their eye and later attaches to something because it seems right. Calvin had picked it up on that ridge. She was certain of that, the same way she was certain of the things she had never needed to verify because she had known him for 50 years. The bus from the city to Knoxville left at 6:40 in the morning and took 9 hours with one transfer in Louisville, which Adele spent in the particular stillness of someone traveling towards something they cannot fully picture yet. She had her 2 suitcases in the luggage compartment below. Calvin's note was in her bag. The key with the pine cone was in her coat pocket. She had a window seat on the right side. She watched the landscape move through its changes, the flat grid of the Ohio Valley giving way to the rolling country of Kentucky, the hills rising gradually as they moved south, the trees thicker and darker, the sky a different quality of gray. She had not been to Tennessee in 11 years, not since a trip she and Calvin had taken to visit an old colleague of his in Chattanooga. She remembered the way the mountains appeared on the horizon before you expected them, as if they had simply stepped forward from somewhere just out of sight. She did not think about Wyndham Avenue on the bus. She thought about Calvin in 1987, 37 years old, driving south on a Friday afternoon in the green Ford he'd had at the time, the one with the tailgate that required a particular technique to open, that he had driven until it had 200,000 miles on it, and then mourned for longer than was strictly necessary. She thought about him pulling over on Ridgeback Road and standing there looking at the valley and the mountains beyond it, and thinking someday. She thought about all the Saturdays after that when he had loaded salvage timber into whatever truck he had at the time and driven south without telling her where he was going. He had been good at keeping things. It was the same quality that had made the reverse mortgage possible, the capacity to carry something alone, to process it in private, and present her only with the resolved version. She had loved that quality for 50 years, and she had also, in the months since learning about the mortgage, felt the weight of what it meant to be on the other side of it. You were protected. You were also kept out. Both things were true, and she had made a kind of peace with both of them in the way you make peace with the qualities of people you loved who were no longer there to ask about it. The transfer in Louisville was 40 minutes. She sat in the station with coffee and looked at photographs of Sable Creek on her phone. The town had grown. That much was clear from the images. The renovated storefronts, the boutique hotels on the main street, the restaurants with outdoor seating facing the creek. She found a real estate listing for a property 2 lots down from the address on her deed, listed at a number that made her sit still for a moment. She found a local newspaper article from 3 years earlier about the development that had come to Sable Creek in the preceding decade, the way the town had been discovered by people from Nashville and Atlanta looking for somewhere quieter, the way property values on the ridge roads in particular had moved in ways that longtime residents had not anticipated. Calvin had driven through Sable Creek in 1987 when it was a small town nobody outside the county had heard of. He had looked at a ridge above the valley and thought it was worth keeping. He had always seen things before other people saw them. The way he could look at a piece of reclaimed wood that everyone else saw as salvage and know immediately what it would become. She had simply not known he applied the same eye to land. The second bus took her from Knoxville into the hill country east of the city, and by the time they reached the stop closest to Sable Creek, the light was the low amber of late afternoon in October, and the mountains were close enough that she could see the tree line on the ridges above the valley. A cab was waiting at the stop. She gave the driver the address from the deed. He knew the road immediately. Ridgeback Road, he said, glancing at the paper. That whole stretch up there has gotten serious in the last few years. You'd be surprised what those lots are worth now. He said it the way people say things that are interesting to them without knowing whether it lands as good news or bad news for the person they're telling. Adele said nothing. She watched the town come into view through the window, the main street, the creek, the old hardware store that had been converted into a restaurant, the side streets climbing toward the ridge roads above. She thought about Calvin driving through here for the first time in 1987 and deciding it was worth stopping for. She thought about him coming back, season after season, year after year, alone in his truck with a load of old timber and a plan he had never once mentioned to her. The cab turned on a Ridgeback Road, and she understood at once why he had pulled over here. The road ran along the spine of a ridge above the valley, and the view from it was the kind of view that made people stop. The mountains to the east, range behind range, the nearest ones dark green and close, the ones beyond going blue with distance in the way that mountains do in the late afternoon. The properties on either side of the road were large and new, stone and cedar, the kind of building that announces significant investment without appearing to try. And then, set back slightly from the road between two of them, was the cabin. It was small, not ruined, not the ruin she had half prepared herself for on the bus, but small and weathered and entirely unlike the properties on either side of it. A single-story structure of dark timber with a covered front porch and shuttered windows and a front path made of flat stones pressed into the mountain soil. The low scrub of the ridge had grown up around it over the years, not in the way of neglect, but in the way of something that had been there long enough to belong. A structure the land had accepted rather than one imposed on it. On the front porch, visible from the road, was a welcome mat. She paid the driver. She took her suitcases. She walked up the flat stone path and stepped onto the porch boards and looked down at the mat. The word on it was the word Calvin had written at the bottom of his note in the slightly cramped handwriting of a man running out of space at the end of a page. Home. She put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance, smoothly, the way a mechanism turns when it has been maintained, which meant Calvin had been here recently enough that the lock had not stiffened. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. She recognized his work before she had taken 3 steps. Not an intellectual recognition. It arrived before thinking, the way recognition arrives when it lives in the body rather than the mind. The joinery on the shelves along the far wall. The window frames fitted with the precision that had been his particular standard for 40 years. The floor laid in boards of varying width, a pattern she had seen him use in the bookshelves he built for their sitting room on Wyndham Avenue. He had used the same pattern here. She understood later, after she had been in the cabin long enough to think about it, that this had been deliberate. He had wanted the place to feel familiar to her before she even knew why. She set her suitcases down and stood without moving. The cabin was cool, carrying the particular dry stillness of a space that has been kept clean and closed. It smelled of wood and cold stone, and something underneath both of those that she could not name except by its effect, which was to make the space feel inhabited in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. It felt like Calvin. She walked through each room. The front room with its shelves and the small wood stove and the two windows facing the road. The narrow kitchen with cabinet hardware she recognized as salvage. Victorian glass knobs she had seen him bring home from a demolition job years ago, wrapped in cloth, carried with the care he reserved for things he intended to use properly. She had asked him at the time what he was saving them for. He had said he had something in mind. The back bedroom held a bed frame he had built, oak from the look and weight of it, fitted together without visible hardware in the style of old construction. A small dresser, a window that looked out at the ridge dropping away toward the valley below. She went out through the back door onto the covered porch. Two rocking chairs, side by side, facing the mountains. He had made them himself. She could see that without examining them closely. The proportions, the curve of the back slats, the way the arms joined the uprights. The same hand that had made the dining table on Wyndham Avenue and the window bench in their bedroom. He had made two chairs and placed them side by side, facing the best view she had ever seen, and he had done it alone, and he had sat in one of them on those weekend visits and looked at these mountains and thought about the day he would bring her here, and she would sit in the other one. She sat in the left chair, the one that felt like hers before she had sat in it. The mountains were everything the photograph on her phone had suggested, and also nothing like it, in the way of things that could be seen in images but not understood until you were standing in front of them. Range after range going east, the nearest ridges dark with the fir and hardwood of a Tennessee October, the ones behind fading through shades of blue until they were barely distinguishable from the sky. The valley below was in shadow now, the last of the afternoon light sitting only on the highest elevations, and the air had the cold clarity of mountain air after a clear day. She held the key with the pine cone and looked at the mountains Calvin had been looking at alone since 1987. She was not ready to cry again. She had cried in the motel room and on the bus, and she was finished with it for now. What she was sitting in the chair he had made for her, on the porch he had built for her, facing the mountains he had been saving for her, did not have a simple name. It was close to the feeling of being known by someone completely, of being loved in a way that had taken decades to build and had not stopped when the person who built it died. She stayed until the light was gone from the highest ridges. Then she went inside and made tea on the small stove and slept in the bed Calvin had made, in the cabin Calvin had built on land that was hers. His name was Grover Finch, and he appeared at the bottom of the flat stone path on the third morning with the punctuality of someone who does not wait for invitations because he has long since decided he does not require them. He was perhaps 60, wearing the kind of casual clothing that is designed to look effortless and costs considerable effort. The particular uniform of mountain town wealth that Adele had noticed on the people walking Ridgeback Road, looking at the cabin with the assessing eye of people calculating what something is worth and why it has not yet been replaced with something more consistent with the neighborhood. He had a business card, heavy stock, the name of a development company she had seen on signage around town. He smiled the smile of someone who has come to do someone a favor. She was on the front porch with her morning coffee when he came up the path. She watched him stop at the porch steps, which he did not climb without being invited, which told her he was practiced at this. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I heard you'd arrived. My name is Grover Finch. I've been hoping to speak with someone about this property for quite some time." "I know who you are," she said. She did not invite him to sit. He explained what she had already understood from looking at the properties on either side of hers. The stretch of Ridgeback Road had become extremely desirable over the past decade. Her parcel, the lot, the position on the ridge, the view, was in a location that would support a structure significantly more valuable than what currently stood on it. He had been watching the property for several years, waiting for someone with clear title to appear. He had a number in mind. He stated it. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that would have felt impossible to her 2 years ago, before everything changed. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Calvin in 1987, stopping his truck on this road, because he saw something in it that no one else was seeing yet. She thought about 34 years of weekend visits, salvaged timber loaded into the back of successive trucks, the Victorian glass knobs wrapped in cloth. She thought about the 2 rocking chairs on the back porch. "I'm not selling," she said. His expression shifted in the small, controlled way of someone who does not allow himself visible reactions. He asked whether she had considered the practical realities, the cost of maintaining the property taxes in this area, her situation as a recent arrival, without local support or resources. He paused on the word recent in a way that was not quite a pause. "I have considered them," she said. "I'm not selling." He left his card on the porch railing and said he hoped she would think further about it and that he was available anytime. Then he went back down the flat stone path, and she watched him go and picked up her coffee. She was not naive about the practical realities he had named. She had spent the 2 nights since arriving at the cabin sitting at Calvin's table with a cup of tea and a yellow legal pad, the way she had always worked through things that needed working through, by writing the numbers down and looking at them without either hope or fear distorting the view. The property taxes on Ridgeback Road were significant. Her resources were not. She had the storage unit in Ohio with what remained of her household, her Social Security, Calvin's small pension, and the cabin itself. The numbers were uncomfortable. They were not impossible, but they required a plan. She had not yet found the wooden box. She found it that same afternoon on the high shelf in the back bedroom closet behind a folded wool blanket. It was a simple box, pine, dovetail jointed at the corners in the way Calvin joined everything, clean, precise, built to last. Inside it were documents. Not legal documents, not deeds or financial records, but a different kind of record entirely. Calvin had kept notes on every piece of wood he had used in the cabin, written in the same neat, angular handwriting as his letter, on index cards filed in order, each one describing a specific timber or board, where it had come from, what structure it had been part of when that structure had been demolished, and which organization or individual he had worked with to salvage it before the demolition crews arrived. The records went back to 1988. There were more than 200 cards. She sat on the edge of the bed and read through them slowly. A courthouse in Sevier County, demolished 1991. A Victorian hotel in Knoxville, demolished 1994. A 19th century mill in Upper East Tennessee, demolished 2001. A church in Cott County, demolished 2007. The wood from each of these structures, or portions of it, had ended up in this cabin. Calvin had documented all of it. The provenance, the age of the timber, the species where he knew it, the organizations he had coordinated with in the historic preservation community who had helped him gain access before the wrecking crews came in. She set the last card down and looked around the bedroom with different eyes than she had been using. She had known the cabin was Calvin's work. She had not known what the work contained. She had not known that the walls and the floors and the shelves were built from structures that no longer existed anywhere else, that the cabin was in some sense a record of things that had been lost, and the only place where parts of them had survived. She picked up her phone and called Penny. His name was Hugh Fenwick, and he walked the ridge trail below Ridgeback Road every morning at 7:30, which Adele learned on her 5th day when she came down the back slope at 7:45 and found him stopped at the tree line, looking up at the rear of the cabin with the focused attention of someone who looks at structures the way other people look at paintings. He was perhaps 65, lean, with the weathered face of someone who spends considerable time outdoors, and a particular quality of attention in his eyes that marked him as someone who notices things other people walk past. He apologized when he realized she had come down the slope behind him. He said he had been walking this trail for 4 years, and had always stopped at this property and had never been able to stop wondering about it. She told him it was hers. He asked, with genuine rather than polite interest, whether she would mind telling him about the structure, who had built it, when, and with what materials. She told him about Calvin, the deed from 1987, the weekends driving south with loads of salvage timber, the 34 years of work he had put into the cabin without telling her it existed. She watched Hugh's expression change as she talked, the general interest sharpening into something more specific and more serious. He asked if he could look more closely at the cabin. She said yes. He spent the better part of 3 hours inside. She made coffee and sat on the back porch and listened to him moving through the rooms, stopping, moving again. Occasionally, he asked a question through the open back door. What she knew about a particular section of flooring, whether Calvin had left records of where specific materials had come from. She told him about the wooden box and the index cards. He went quiet for a long moment after that. When he came out, he sat in the second rocking chair and was silent in the way of someone organizing what they want to say rather than deciding whether to say it. Your husband was an extraordinary craftsman, he said. I want to be careful with that word because I use it rarely. Do you know what species the primary structural timber is? The floor joists, the wall framing, the ceiling boards in the front room? She said she did not know the name of it, that she knew the feel of it, heavier and warmer than ordinary wood. The way old timber in historic buildings felt different from new construction. It is American chestnut, he said. She looked at him. The American chestnut was functionally extinct as a timber species by the middle of the 20th century, he said. A blight arrived from Asia around 1900 and worked through the eastern forest for the next 40 years and killed somewhere between 3 and 4 billion trees. The standing timber was harvested as it died and used in construction through the 20s and 30s. After that, there was no more. What exists now in old buildings is what remains of the entire supply. Your husband found it in structures slated for demolition and saved it. He looked at the cabin wall beside them. The framing of this cabin alone represents timber that has not been commercially available for 80 years. There is no replacing it. There is no replicating it. Adele looked at the mountains. He always saved things, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said that the wooden box of index cards changed the nature of what the cabin was. Provenance, he said, was the difference between something valuable and something irreplaceable. Calvin had documented every source, every demolished structure, every organization he had worked with. That documentation meant the timber in the cabin was not just rare, it was traceable, verifiable, connected to specific buildings with specific histories. There were preservation organizations that would consider the cabin significant. There were collectors of historic architecture who would pay a very different number than the one Grover Finch had put on the table. Not for the land, but for the cabin itself and what it contained. For the documented American chestnut alone, he said, and then he named a figure. Adele looked at the rocking chair arm under her hand. She had been running her palm along it since she sat down, the way she always ran her hand along Calvin's dining table on Wyndham Avenue. She understood now why the wood felt the way it felt. He offered to put her in contact with a historic preservation attorney he knew who worked with properties in the Tennessee mountains. He offered to write a formal architectural assessment of the cabin, the kind of document that could anchor any conversation about its value and make clear to anyone reading it what Calvin had actually built and why it could not be reproduced. He said he would do both without charge. She asked him why, directly the way she asked things. He looked at the index card she had brought out and set on the small table between chairs. Because a man spent 34 years saving wood that the rest of the world let be destroyed, he said, and he kept records of every piece of it, and someone should understand what that means before it ends up in the wrong hands. She thanked him. He stood to leave. He looked at the 2 rocking chairs. He made 2, she said before he could ask. Hugh Fenwick ran his hand along the arm of the chair he had been sitting in. He said nothing more, which was exactly the right thing to do. Then he went back down the slope toward the trail, and she listened to his footsteps fade into the sound of the wind moving through the ridge timber above the cabin. The attorney Hugh put her in contact with was a woman named Rowena Tate, who had spent 25 years working with historic properties in the Tennessee mountains and who had, in the week following their first phone call, confirmed everything Hugh had described and added several things he had not mentioned. The American chestnut documentation was the foundation, she said, but the index card were only part of it. Calvin had also, in his methodical way, filed the relevant demolition permits and salvage agreements with the organizations he had worked with over the years, copies of which Rowena's office had already located in the records of 3 separate Tennessee preservation bodies. The cabin was not just documented by Calvin's handwritten cards. It was documented by the organizations that had granted him access to those structures in the first place. The provenance chain was clean and verifiable going back to 1988. Rowena described the market for the cabin with the directness of someone who has spent decades being accurate rather than reassuring. The right buyer. And there were such buyers, people who collected architecturally significant structures the way others collected art, would pay considerably more than Grover Finch's number. Finch's number was for the land. What the cabin represented, properly documented and assessed, was a different conversation. Adele listened and asked careful questions. She had managed household finances for 50 years and had learned in that time to be precise about numbers and skeptical of figures that arrived with too much confidence behind them. She understood what Rowena was describing. She also thought about Hugh sitting in the second rocking chair and what he had said about buyers who would want the cabin as it was. And she thought about Calvin's 2 chairs and the welcome mat and the note that had ended with the word home. She had a different idea. She told Rowena about on their 3rd call, laying it out the way she laid out decisions that required thinking. The income side, the cost side, the question still open. Rowena listened without interrupting and then was quiet in the way of someone actually thinking rather than preparing to respond. It could work, Rowena said. The zoning would require a variance application. The historic designation, if they pursued it, would open grant opportunities that could offset renovation costs. It would not be simple, but it could work. Adele called Penny. Penny drove down from Nashville that weekend, and they sat on the back porch with blankets across their laps and looked at the mountains and talked through all of it, the practical dimensions, the financial ones, and the other dimensions that did not reduce to numbers. Penny was practical and loving in the way of a daughter who had stopped trying to protect her mother from hard things and started trusting her to handle them. She asked the right questions and listened to the answers. "Are you sure?" Penny asked at the end. Adele looked at the mountains. "Calvin built this for us," she said. "Not for me to sell to a developer. For us to be in." She paused. "I can be in it for both of us." The renovation took 5 months, which was longer than the contractor initially estimated and shorter than Adele had feared. She managed it the way she had managed everything, by understanding what needed to happen and doing it in the right order, by being present at the site every day, by asking questions and following up when the answers were incomplete. A household was a complex system requiring daily attention and the willingness to address problems before they became larger ones. A renovation operated on the same principles. The cabin's structure required almost no intervention. Calvin had built it to last, and it had lasted. What it needed was the kind of work that makes something habitable in a sustained way. Updated plumbing, a heating system suited to mountain winters, a kitchen equipped for actual use. She kept every surface Calvin had made, every shelf, every floorboard, every fitted piece of American chestnut. The contractor, a man named Gill who had worked in the Sable Creek area for 30 years and understood old materials better than most, told her on the 2nd week that in his career he had never worked on anything built like this. He said it the way people say things they mean without decoration. She made one addition. On the back porch beside the 2 rocking chairs, she had a small plaque made by a craftsman in town who worked in bronze. Mounted on a piece of American chestnut from a board Calvin had left in the woodshed, the only piece he had not yet used. The plaque read, "Built by Calvin Arthur Marsh, woodworker. 1987 to 2021. Built for love. Built to last." She named the In the Woodsman's Ridge. Penny had suggested other names that performed better in search results, names that more immediately signaled mountain getaway to people browsing online. Adele listened to all of them and kept her own. Calvin had been a woodworker, and this was his ridge, and the name was not a decision she was going to make based on search results. 5 rooms, each furnished with the care of someone who has thought seriously about what it means to give people a place to rest. Hugh Fenwick's written assessment, circulated among the preservation and architectural communities he moved in, brought the first inquiries before the renovation was finished. By the time the doors opened in March, the first 6 weeks were already booked. Grover Finch had driven slowly past the property on a Thursday in February while the contractor's vehicles were still in the drive. He had not stopped. He had not left a card. The Woodsman's Ridge opened on a Saturday in March, cold and bright, with the particular clarity of a Tennessee mountain spring that has not decided to be warm, but has agreed to be clear. The mountains to the east were sharp against the sky in a way they were not in summer, when haze softened the ridgelines. Penny came for the opening and stayed 4 days. On the second morning, she found the 2 rocking chairs on the back porch and stood looking at them before she sat in the right one. Adele watched from the kitchen window and did not go out. Some things needed to be understood privately before they could be shared. Penny needed a few minutes alone with what the chairs meant. Adele understood this because she had needed weeks. The first guests came largely through Hugh Fenwick's network. Preservation historians, craftspeople, architects who understood what the cabin's materials represented. They moved through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces, asking questions. Several cried in small ways they seemed embarrassed by. Adele did not find this strange. She had touched the same surfaces for the first time and understood what the wood gave back. By summer, the calendar was full through October. The following spring, the waiting list ran 6 weeks. The guests shifted as word spread beyond the preservation community. Couples, families, people who had read about the Woodsman's Ridge in a travel piece and arrived without knowing anything about American chestnut or Provenance chains, who simply wanted to be somewhere that felt built with care. They felt it when they walked in. Most said so in the guest book. Several wrote at length about what they felt without being entirely able to explain it, which was the correct response. She moved in 3 weeks before the opening, on a cold, overcast day. Penny helped her unpack, stayed 2 days, and cried once quietly when she read the plaque on the back porch for the first time. Adele held her and said nothing. Some things arrived in their own time. She placed Calvin's portrait on the table, where she could see it from her chair in the mornings, the same position it had held on Wyndham Avenue, because some arrangements were correct and did not need reconsidering. On an evening in late October, 7 months after the opening, Adele sat in her rocking chair and watched the sun go down over the western ridge. The last autumn guests had gone. The mountain light was doing what it did at this hour, amber and rose working down the eastern faces of the ranges, shadows rising from the valleys to meet it. The valley floor had been in shade for an hour. When the light was gone, the stars would come out the way they came out at elevation, more of them and sharper than anywhere in the flatlands. She held the key with the pine cone. In the evenings, when the day had settled, her hand always found it. She thought about Calvin at 37, standing on this ridge for the first time, looking at this view, thinking someday. The 34 years of someday that followed. The trucks loaded with timber. The weekends she had believed were work trips. The Victorian glass knobs wrapped in cloth. The index cards of the dovetail-jointed wooden box. The floor in the same pattern as the bookshelves on Wyndham Avenue, because he had thought about what home felt like and built those feelings into the structure before she ever arrived. The bank had taken the house on Wyndham Avenue. The kitchen table, the bookshelves, the yard she had spent 50 years planting into something the neighbors stopped to look at from the sidewalk. All of it gone, because those things were attached to a property used as collateral for a loan that had bought them 2 more years together. She had made her peace with losses that were real and permanent, not by pretending they did not matter, but by carrying them forward into what came after. What the bank had not known about was a deed folded behind a photograph in a frame with a hidden back panel only a woodworker would know how to build. The key with the pine cone. 34 years of Calvin loading salvage timber that the rest of the world was letting be destroyed. The American chestnut that had not been commercially available since before either of them was born. 2 chairs on a porch facing the best view she had ever seen, one for him and one for her, on a ridge he had never been able to bring her to while he was alive. She heard the back door open. One of the guests, a woman from Asheville whose company Adele had found, over 2 days of meals and brief conversation, genuinely good, came to the railing and apologized for interrupting. "You're not interrupting," Adele said. They looked at the mountains together in a quiet neither of them tried to fill. This happened sometimes. The view produced a silence that most people when they encountered it, had the good sense to leave alone. "Your husband built all of this?" the woman asked after a while. "He built the cabin," Adele said. "I built the rest." The woman nodded. She seemed to understand that this was a complete answer, which it was. The guest went inside. The last light left the highest peaks. The stars came out over the ridge. Adele sat in her chair and held the pine cone key and was in the specific and ordinary and irreplaceable way of a person who has arrived where they are supposed to be, at home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.